Good evening, everyone. I'm Jacqui Scruby. Welcome to the Planning Forum to discuss the reforms to the New South Wales planning system. I know there are a lot of people in the room here who are engaged in potential developments in the area. That includes developments that are currently with DA. It includes properties that are being acquired for the purpose of development. I know that's happening a bit on the eastern side of Mona Vale. It also includes people that are subject to developments for state significant development, and I know some people from Narrabeen may be here as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge everyone in the room who has been active in contacting my office and been engaged in the planning process and some of the planning reforms that are already taking effect here in Mona Vale and more broadly across Pittwater. Also acknowledging the Wilga Wilson development up in Ingleside. I also wanted to comment, there's some residents groups here. So Kelvin is here from Mona Vale Residents Association. I haven't seen Phil Walker from Friends of Mona Vale yet, but I know that he may be here as well. We also have councillors here tonight. So Councillor Dillon just walked in on cue. We've got Councillor Robins as well from Narrabeen Ward and Councillor DeLuca as well. And I've also seen Michael Genches here as well, so hello Michael, and a couple of others in the room as well. Bathrooms are here, doors are here, so that's the housekeeping done. If we do need to evacuate, it's at the back. It's on my run sheet here to talk about. But I thought I might just get the councillors to come up, introduce themselves, and so you know who they are, because I know there are developments in different areas of Pittwater. So do you want to just introduce yourself?
Thank you, Jacqui. Yes, I'm Councillor Ruth Robins. I'm Narrabeen Ward. It's really very pleasing to see so many people here this evening. These SSD developments, or even just larger developments, have the potential to change where we live, not in so many different ways, and it's just so good to see and feel what the community's thinking. And I congratulate you all on it not being all emotive, it's actually being factual, and a lot of thought and energy has gone into it. So I'd just like to congratulate, and I guess being Narrabeen Ward, in particular the Moran, those Michelle and Hannah that have been put together, and really encourage through social media the types of submissions that they're asking the residents to do. Like I said, I'm Narrabeen Ward, although always here to help with Councillor DeLuca and Councillor Dillon too.
Thanks, Ruth, and I'd particularly like to thank the Honourable Member for Pittwater, Jacqui Scruby, for holding this event tonight, because it's imperative that we as a community hear from our planning staff, James Farrington, who is Council's new Director of Planning, and Mal McDonough, who also is a Manager of Planning and Strategy. So I thank you, and you particularly, for having this forum. Tonight, we come together to look at very serious proposals which, as Ruth said, will change our community significantly if they are passed. Some have bypassed completely Northern Beaches Council as state significant developments, and therefore the State Planning Department, as well as the Minister, will have the ultimate determining say. That's why it is so important for all of us to make submissions within the time period and have your say on exactly what you want for the future of our area. But again, I thank you, Jacqui, for convening this meeting, because it's all very important that we all come together as a community and have our say. So thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. And thank you, Ruth. Also, my name is Rowie Dillon. I'm a councillor for the Pittwater Ward, and I'm very active. So I'd like to thank Jacqui and her team, and also James and his team, for talking to you all tonight about our future. It's extremely important, and as you know, we're all extremely passionate. Welcome, Councillor Causey. Thank you again, Jacqui, and Miranda, here you are to do a little bit of an intro about yourself.
Hi everyone. So I think a lot of you will know me. I'm Miranda Causey, Pittwater Greens councillor. I also will thank Jacqui for putting this forum together, and our new Head of Planning, James Farrington, for coming along to speak to us. All I can say is these reforms are going to centralise planning, and they're going to take away basically the community say, and they're going to also, because planning is going to be so centralised, it's going to concentrate planning in the hands of 2 or 3 people, and so it introduces the potential for corruption. So I also am encouraging everybody to please write to the government ministers and the opposition, and make as much noise as you can. And I know Jacqui and Michael Regan have already got a couple of amendments up. The Greens have 25 amendments up in the upper house to try and change the bill, so we'll see how we go.
And tonight, to go through a lot of the reforms and the details, we'll have some slides up, and as people have mentioned, James Farrington, who's new to Northern Beaches Council, as Director of Planning and Place, will be joining us to go through those, and that'll be the nuts and bolts of some of these reforms and how they will be impacting how things have previously been and how they will be now under the new reforms. And we've also got Mal McDonald as well from Council as well. Do you want to just wave your hand so people can see? Because of that, sort of anything I say tonight, I will not be overly political. I will, of course, speak about how I've been talking in Parliament about these reforms, and also the political context. As Miranda mentioned, they are not through the House yet. They're through the lower house, but not the upper house. They will go through the Legislative Council, most likely next week. And but if I make any comments, any political comments, that's not to reflect on Council. Obviously, Council is neutral, so I just wanted to make that point. To give you the broader context of these reforms, as I mentioned, there are some DAs happening at the moment that would have existed through our usual reform, through our usual planning scheme. We have state significant developments which have been in our planning scheme for a while, but we also have these new reforms which have been introduced by the Minns government to address the housing crisis, and these reforms are the biggest reforms in 50 years. And they do a lot to streamline what has been and arguably has been a complex planning scheme. And so many mum and dad developers may welcome that, you know, they have one agency now to deal with rather than multiple if they have a development. But the reality is these are developer-led reforms. And you only need to pick up the paper to see, you know, Morris Yema's been in to the office of the Premier and meetings haven't been disclosed, but we also know that a lot of developers and a lot of the groups that support developers have been pushing these reforms, and they have been worked on not only by the Labor Party but also and the government, but also by the Liberal Party as well. So these are bipartisan reforms. They have been pushed through both houses. They have not gone to inquiry or committee, and as Miranda mentioned, there are serious concerns regarding not only the planning reforms for housing, and we'll discuss those tonight, but there have also been significant concerns regarding these reforms to do with all matters of development. So I'm talking renewable projects, coal mines, mining projects, data centres, and more is coming to light that these reforms are not only intended for housing but will have implications for bigger proposals as well. Miranda mentioned the amendment that I put through, so that amendment I thought was probably the most relevant to Pittwater, and that was there are a series of amendments to the objects of the Planning and Environment Act, and those objects originally, which have been in the Act for a while, one of them includes to protect our native habitat. And what the government was seeking to do, whilst on the one hand saying it's the biggest reform in 50 years, and on the other hand saying, oh, nothing will really change, we're just streamlining it, what was really telling that they were changing the objects of the Act. And so one of those changes, there were many, one of them was to, instead of the object of the Act to conserve our natural environment, it was to conserve our natural environment in habitats where endangered species exist. So that very much limits the definition. So I was able to move an amendment to restore the objects of the Act to be what they currently are, which is to protect all native environments, not just ones where endangered species live. And I suppose that's particularly relevant to some of our corridors here. It's not a silver bullet. It's not progress. It's just trying to prevent those objects being eroded. There were other objects that were amended successfully as well, such as the provision of housing, healthy houses. We all don't want houses with mould. We want to make sure that they have enough sunlight and ventilation. And so when those objects were sought to be amended and watered down, that was a cause for concern as well. As Miranda mentioned, there are more amendments which I think are pretty unlikely to pass through the upper house, but everyone's giving it a good red hot crack. When I say everyone, the Greens and some other independent members are moving amendments, but the context cannot be denied, and that context is that New South Wales Government is seeking to build as many houses as possible with developer-led reforms and a blanket approach. So I'm a community independent. I believe in community voice. The amount of effort and community engagement that goes into developing local planning controls like the LEP, the Development Control Plan, a lot of community involvement where council does listen to community to be able to develop those local planning controls. And then there is a strong sense in our community that we have respect for those controls, that developments are made in line with the planning scheme, and that is the expectation I know of people who I've spoken to in this community. And that also, if a development does come up, there'll be ample time for community to have their voice heard through the submissions process, whether that be a DA or a state significant development. Now, the reforms that we'll hear about tonight are blanket. They impact the whole of New South Wales. You'll be hearing about the changes to the Planning Act more broadly, and some of the agencies, or rather authorities that have been set up, such as the Housing Delivery Authority, which we'll go through, and that's 3 people, which is a bit of a cause for concern. There are other authorities that are also set up, and we'll go through what that means. But in a nutshell, it's going to shift to a more streamlined approach. There'll be more CDCs, so comply development, so consent, which means less DAs, which means less community voice, and there will be more opportunities for state significant developments under the current government. I will pull out a few quotes. Paul Scully, the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, released a media release today, and he had mentioned also in his second reading of the bill that his aim is to approve them being the houses, and build them as quickly as possible under these reforms. And I suppose my disappointment is also from the opposition. You do generally believe that opposition will oppose, but some of the comments coming from the opposition are that they're unashamedly YIMBY, and that we are now pro-supply, a YIMBY-based party, getting government out of the way and letting developers build houses. So I want to put that context in, because this is facing the whole of New South Wales, not just Pittwater. There aren't many people in Parliament opposing this because the 2 major parties are working together. But that said, community does have a voice, and we'll go through that where you can have an opportunity, like in state significant developments. And also, like all reforms, it takes community engagement over a long period of time where things can change as well. So tonight I don't bring great news, but it is very important for everyone to understand what the changes are, to understand and be realistic about those changes, but also to understand how to be involved in the planning process. And although we won't go through all developments tonight that the community is facing, I'll be around afterwards to have a chat, and we will have an opportunity for questions afterwards as well. So the format tonight will be, I'll be introducing James. He'll set the context for what we need to do as a community to deliver housing, and the context set by the federal government as well as the state government, and then we'll delve into the detail of the new reforms. I will ask him questions if I think we need to explore further, but we'll get the community questions at the end of the presentation. We will also start on the low to mid-rise. Is that right, James? Yeah, we'll start on the low to mid-rise. And as people may know, low to mid-rise is a new policy that is being enabled by the new reforms, and that increases within 400 to 800 metres, increases the low to mid-rise density that an area can have if it's declared a town centre like Mona Vale has been. At the time when I've been in this position for a year, at the time when I ran in the election, the town centres hadn't been announced. On the list of where Northern Beaches Council had been consulting with government were Narrabeen, Warriewood, Mona Vale, Avalon and Newport. The definition, I think I remember actually when I was a private citizen putting on all of Facebook groups, everyone should write a submission to the consultation in 2023 around low to mid-rise, because the definition was very blunt. It was, do you have a full-line supermarket? And that was that was pretty much the only criteria that gave anyone guidance as to where low to mid-rise would be declared. So they've been declared across New South Wales, and Mona Vale is one of them, and we'll talk tonight about the implications for that. Under the new scheme, it's considered a targeted assessment pathway, which will be accelerated, which we'll talk about. And I think something to note as well is that the new legislation sets up the framework for targeted assessment pathways, of which low to mid-rise is one. We don't know what all the other targeted assessment pathways are, and the government will be able to declare more, and that won't have parliamentary scrutiny. So I think it's safe to say there's more to come. From the media release today, the Planning Minister did say more than 50,000 new housing approvals have been approved in the past year, and that's the first time that since 2023 the state has reached this milestone. He claims it's showing momentum growing in New South Wales pipeline, and he said according to the last ABS data, housing approvals in New South Wales have risen 23% year on year. Obviously, we'll hear tonight about other figures that maybe are nuanced, and we can have that discussion. And I think it's also important to recognise, which I'm calling from the rooftops in Parliament, that I don't think these blanket reforms are the answer to the housing crisis. We obviously have higher construction costs, we've got worker shortages, and particularly in our areas, we've got a problem where often apartments may be pulled down and luxury apartments put up, and the net yield will actually be less. And that's not solving the housing crisis at all. So I am your voice in Parliament. I won't be able to win this battle, but I will continue, and I think it's important you let my office know about stories so I can continue to bring those to the Parliament floor and to advocate for everyone. But James, if you'd like to come up and take everyone through the reforms.
Thanks, Jacqui. I've got a slideshow, but I've just realised probably some of you won't be able to see it if I stand up there. But first of all, a few thank yous. Firstly, thank you to Jacqui. As she said, this is my 5th week at council, and I get to come along and meet with you all. But one thing that is certainly apparent to me is the fact that we've got a full room, and there is so much passion about planning on the Northern Beaches and this particular issue, which is to do with housing provision. I'd also like to acknowledge the councillors and also send an apology from Mayor Hines. Unfortunately, she had other commitments which meant she couldn't make it tonight. As Jacqui said, I've got a slideshow, hopefully take you through some of the major issues, but I thought it was also important to set the context for why we're having the discussion we are tonight about housing provision and legislation changes. So bear with me because I don't know your levels of understanding of planning reform, so I'm going to try and cover all bases. But I think this slide in relation to, if you read the Sydney Morning Herald, shows a recent article and quotes from the Premier about housing, and he certainly put on councils on notice that we are in a housing crisis. We have a shortage of housing, and the state government is committed in its actions to address that crisis. As Jacqui said, this comes down not only at the state level, but at a federal level, which acknowledges this isn't a problem just for New South Wales, but across Australia, which is why we have the National Housing Accord. That sets a target for housing provision across Australia. And what they've done under that housing accord is they've split that down into targets for each state. State of New South Wales, a 5-year target, is 377,000 dwellings over a 5-year period. So what does that look like? If you break that down into how much housing we need to provide, that equates to a 25-storey building being delivered somewhere in Sydney 7 days a week 365 days a year. That is our challenge. The only decision we've got is how we provide that housing. It gets broken down further. The state government acknowledges that we've got a state target, but each local government area, each council, has a role to play in providing housing within its local government area. So what the state government done is it's set a target individually for each council to provide over the next 5 years. For the Northern Beaches local government area, it's 5,900 dwellings over a 5-year period. So at the state level, we've got that one 25-storey building every day. For Northern Beaches, it's the equivalent of a 5-storey residential flat building every 2 weeks. The decision for our council is how we provide that housing. If it's not a 5-storey building, is it subdivisions, is it townhouses? What form of housing do we want to provide to meet that target? So we know the target. The difficulty we've got from the industry perspective, as well reported, is that's being monitored on completions. So that's completion of a 5-storey building every 2 weeks. Key to walk in. But the problem that the industry is saying is it's not feasible to deliver under the current market. So we're not seeing delivery on those housing targets. Predictions are that we're going to get anywhere between 50 and 60% of that target for the state. And the industry is saying the reason we're not getting it is because of the cost of building materials, which have gone up, shortage in labour, also interest rates and the like. So at the time we've got to provide additional housing, the feasibility of providing that housing is becoming more challenging. So how's that reflected? So you've got a housing target requiring the supply, you've got the industry saying we can't feasibly provide it, and at the same time, people can't afford to buy housing. The average price to buy a house in Sydney at the moment is about $1.6 million. Think of a first home buyer wanting to buy their first home, it's $1.6 million for a home. If you want to buy a unit, it's about $900,000. You come to the Northern Beaches, you want to buy a home, you're looking at around about $2.65 million to buy a home. So the challenge in terms of affordability is going up. At the same time, the community is saying, it's enough, we're full. Not here. No more housing. The infrastructure is not keeping pace with the level of development. Our schools are full, open space is full, our parks are full. So we get a perfect storm. But Northern Beaches, sorry, previous council, I've given the secret away. But Northern Beaches has been very proactive in this space. It hasn't shirked its responsibility in providing housing. So its planning controls already have significant capacity to accommodate that target of 5,900 dwellings. Also, all of you from the Northern Beaches will be aware of the extensive work that's been done on the precinct around French's Forest to deliver housing. We're currently working on a structure plan for Brookvale to provide additional homes. And there's a significant development proposal, which we'll probably talk about, but in relation to the Warringah Mall development to provide another 1,500 homes. So council's done a lot of strategic work to meet that target, and it's done it in a very responsible way. It does that by providing housing opportunities close to commercial centres, in a centres-based approach, where the community knows where we're going to get change, to seek to preserve the balance of the local government area. One of the other projects we're working on is the Mona Vale Place Plan, which some of you may be familiar with, which is looking at, based on development that's occurring, how we can improve the centre, the vibrancy of the centre, connections within the centre, and how it relates to the surrounding residential area. However, the state government has made it very clear that notwithstanding all that great strategic work that's being done by not only Northern Beaches Council but by a lot of other councils, we're still nowhere near meeting that dwelling target, which is why they introduced the low and mid-rise housing reforms. The aim of those reforms in terms of the state government's position is it will provide opportunities for about 112,000 dwellings of that 377,000 target. It's been rolled out in stages. First stage came in July 2024, which was aimed at dual occupancies. For this area, council had already been on the front foot. We already enabled dual occupancies in the local government area, so it didn't change much. The second stage commenced in February, which is the ones which we're seeing more rolled out, and I'll take you through those, and they're about low rise. So that is the centres-based approach which has come out now. The first one I've touched on, so that allows within our low density residential zones, which is most of the residential areas within a local government area where you can have dwelling houses. What that basically said, there was a lot of local government areas which didn't allow you to subdivide or create dual occupancies, duplexes or the like. So that state government legislation said, mandated across the state, if you've got a low density zone, you can do a dual occupancy or a duplex or the like. The second stage has more implications. That's one where it's focused on increasing density around nominated commercial centres or train stations. There's about 127 in the state. 171, thanks Mal. Mal's right across it. He's our strategic planner and done a lot of this work, so I should have acknowledged him as well. There's 9 in our local government area, and those are the ones up on the screen there. The one you'll be interested in, probably the last one there, which is Mona Vale, which many of you'll be aware of. The changes that were introduced through stage 2 are within a walkable catchment of the centre, 800 metres, that's what it's based on. And for any lands, residential lands, which are zoned low density residential, in other words, zoned for dwelling houses, within 800 metres, you can now do terraces, townhouses or manor homes. They're permitted land uses within 800 metres of the centre. Manor homes are like where you have a large home and you have 2 dwellings at the bottom and 2 dwellings up the top or the like. It's like a 2-storey residential flat building. But they've been introduced and there are some of the development standards down the bottom. Probably more concerning for the community has been the changes in relation to lands which are zoned R3, which is a townhouse zone under our local environmental plan. Jacqui mentioned this before, there's 2 rings around the centre. One's 400 metres and the next ring is a 400 to 800. In that first ring of 400 from the commercial centre, you can do building heights up to 21 metres. That's around about 4 to 5 stories. In that next ring out, you can do 16 metres, which is around about 3 to 4 stories. So they've introduced where you could have townhouses or terraces. The state government changes now mean that you can have residential flat buildings. First ring 5 to 6 stories, next ring 4 to 5 stories. On top of that, a state policy dealing with affordable housing says you can have a bonus height on top of that if you're providing a percentage of that for affordable housing. So you can get another level on top of that as well. Where does that apply? This is a graphic taken from the Department of Planning website. I'm not sure if the back of the room you can read it, but the north of the screen there is Mona Street, Bassett Street next to the industrial area, Gulf Avenue, down the bottom is Jenkins Street, Rowan Street, out to Maxwell Street and Foley Street. That's not a given. What they've said under the state legislation is up to an applicant to demonstrate whether or not they're within the 800 metres, but that's an indicative layout about where these reforms now apply. So that's the subject lands, and you might have heard I said to you, if your low density, this is a zoning map, is probably too far from the back of the room, but there's two portions, the dark pink in the middle, those are the areas where you can have residential flat buildings. North of the golf course on the southern side of Pittwater Road, and then further up north of the commercial centre. So that's where you can have those residential flat buildings, just within that dark pink area. But it's obviously attractive because we've already received 5 applications within those zones. I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but there you can see the dots, that represents where they are. 2 of them are now subject to appeals in the Land and Environment Court, and 1 of them is being assessed by the Department of State Significant Development. So I mentioned to you before, Council has been proactive in terms of the strategic planning we've done for housing supply, but in response to the recent reforms, Council's also had to react. So where we didn't have development controls, because we didn't permit those residential flat buildings or that density, Council's already prepared controls to govern how that development can occur, addressing things like setback, landscaping, parking and the like. So that's been done. Council's now saying, well, we also need to think about the issues that the residents raised with us, which is how are we going to provide infrastructure to cater for that growth? These changes were implemented without what's called a development contribution, which means where a developer does development, they need to pay a contribution to the councils to fund those necessary infrastructure. So councils now already undertaken a review of these centres based on what we think will be provided in terms of housing numbers to work out what improvements to infrastructure will be required to cater for that growth. We're now going through the process of costing that, so we can come up with what's called a development contributions plan. So when one of these DAs comes in, or development application comes in, we say, right, we levy that development area, if it's approved, to give money to council to fund those infrastructure improvements. Whether it's open space, footpath widening, tree planting, or road improvements. So we're going through that at the moment, and there's a report on also a percentage in relation to affordable housing, which will be going up to council, pleasingly, next month. This month. That's it on the low and mid-rise, Jacqui, so I might hand back to you.
The other thing I was going to mention there, James, is... James, don't run away too quickly. The state government's also announced that there will be more funding from the state government for councils that are meeting DA targets and processing quickly, and my understanding is that Northern Beaches Council is meeting those targets, which may give the opportunity to pitch for more money for some of those civic works that you were mentioning as well.
The short answer to that is right. Each council is also put on notice in terms of their processing times for development applications, so they're mandated. If council doesn't meet those processing times for DAs, the risk is potential loss of planning powers. Pleasing to say Northern Beaches is meeting that target. We process applications around about 86 days, which is a commendable result. That does open council's ability to apply for funding. It is limited though,
It is
Jacqui.
limited and competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other thing to note that we'll probably talk about when we talk about the broader reforms and targeted assessment pathways is that the low to mid-rise reform is a targeted assessment pathway, and that means that maybe you want to talk about the pattern book. So the New South Wales government put out a competition effectively to create some of those dwellings that James mentioned earlier, whether it's a 4-storey building, a manor house, apartment blocks. Put that out to a competitive process and a design process, and the winners of that design are now housed within a pattern book. And that pattern book has the effect of, if a developer chooses to pick a design from that pattern book and use that design within this low to mid-rise area, then they are able, and I'll get you to correct me if I'm wrong, to use the compliant development pathway, which will reduce the opportunity for community voice, reduce council's oversight of the area, and allow them to proceed. And I think that's important because although many developers, and the developers we've seen at the moment haven't used that pattern book, but if they do use that pattern book, some of those things that you were mentioning that you've done since this announcement, like the DCP controls for these, they wouldn't be applicable because these designs are considered pre-approved. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I can add much more than that. You're spot on. And I'll take you through that on the next presentation, but there's going to be a new approval pathway, exactly as you say, that for certain areas where the strategic planning work has already been done, and then someone submits a DA that is consistent with that strategic planning work, it'll be a simplified approval pathway, and there are going to be certain mandated things that council cannot consider. And one of those is in relation to public participation. So the idea there is that the public participation happens up front when those plans are being prepared, and then if someone comes up with a DA, development application, that is consistent with that strategic planning work, it'll get a simplified approval pathway.
That's right. I think a question people may have as well is that there has been action by other councils, so I'm thinking Ku-ring-gai Council, I'm thinking Inner West, where they have challenged the government's low to mid-rise reforms, and although that may seem attractive to start with, when you look at how they've challenged those reforms, it's been, and I'll get you to talk to this mainly, it's been, say, Inner West saying, look, we have heritage areas we don't want in the low to mid-rise area. Instead of having the low to mid-rise reforms, we're happy to have high-rise buildings, and then they've articulated which areas of the LGA where they're prepared to have, 25-storey buildings, for instance. So when there's discussion around challenging the low to mid-rise, it's not challenging as in we're going to challenge and we don't want it at all. It's where councils have proactively put forward alternatives. And I know actually 2 days ago in the Sydney Morning Herald, there were landowners in the Linfield or Roseville area that were upset because they're now faced with a situation where they're going to have a much higher high-rise next to them, and they can't sell up because they're now considered not in the low to mid-rise. So do you want to just talk about challenging these and how realistic that is, or what council's position is on challenging and which other councils have done that?
I'm just thinking about how I might answer that one, because I guess the reason I was asked to come along tonight was to present to you on the legislation. This is legislation that is in force. It is now up for the elected representatives if they want to make further representations on something that we're not being consulted on.
Yeah.
Make it clear, the government has already introduced these controls. They're not open for debate. These are in now. We're getting applications under these reforms. So there's no dialogue with councils. There's no opportunity to have further say on the low and mid-rise. It would be up for the council then to decide whether or not, based on legislation that's in place, whether or not it can challenge them. And I'm aware there's a couple of other councils doing that. But what I'd say about Ku-ring-gai is they are challenging them. I said to you before, the risk that council has is losing its planning powers. Or the risk is you get more than you would have got under the reforms. And that's the issue that Ku-ring-gai is facing at the moment, is are they getting more than they would have got under the reforms. So, Jacqui, I'll just say to you, in answer to your question, is there's not an opportunity for council. We're not being asked that. They are in. So my advice to council is that this is a fact. We now need to work out how we plan for it, how we make representations on all the great work that council's done to date in terms of, and working with our community about how we're going to meet the next phase of our housing numbers.
Yeah, and like I've spoken in Parliament as well about the local housing strategy as well, and that the targets were set to be met. It was interesting actually, Chris Minns the other day when I forget the context in which he was asked, but he did make a comment to remind councils that they are merely just an act of New South Wales Parliament. I think he then retracted it and apologised.
That was my first slide, but I
cut
out that quote.
Oh, did you? That was a bit of a reminder to councils, and look, I think he did retract on the for want of a better word, abruptness or aggressiveness of that quote, but I think the message is clear that, as James mentioned, councils aren't being consulted in this, yet they're doing incredible work. I know Northern Beaches Council is doing incredible work to try and to say, okay, so what and what can we control? And that's where that development control plan for some of these reforms was formulated by council quite quickly afterwards, regarding setbacks and some of the things that are really important to us. One of the things I'm concerned about is our beautiful tree coverage. In my first maiden speech to Parliament, I talked about Pittwater being houses nestled in trees rather than just trees scattered amongst houses. And I think for all of us here, that is just what makes it so special to live here. That you can drive through our areas and basically see hidden houses. And so I think that is important to me. That's why the nature-based amendment was very important. And that's why it is sad to come here with informing you of these changes, but it is also really important that everyone knows about these changes. So what we might do is we might shift to the broader planning reforms and what that means, and I'll maybe interrupt you a couple of times with questions, but I'm happy to go straight to those slides and then I can talk about them in more detail afterwards as well.
I'm sorry it's death by PowerPoint tonight, but I do have a few more slides for you. So I'm not sure how much people have spoken about heard about the planning reforms, but this is a slide, another one from the Sydney Morning Herald, and a headline. The single biggest overhaul of New South Wales planning reforms, planning controls in 50 years. If you're not aware, the governing legislation for planning in New South Wales is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. It was prepared in 1979 and is still the governing piece of legislation in New South Wales today. It has gone under many amendments, but this has been mooted as the biggest reforms since then.
Could you just go back to that slide, James, for a second? Because the Premier holds this up to be indicative. For those who can see it, it's a whole load of boxes and basically what type of chart is it? A flow chart with all the interconnection and all the complexity, and he's saying that they're going to simplify that. And that's what my comment was regarding around some mum and dad developers might think, oh, we've got it a bit easier now. But the reality is all that being simplified under what we'll speak about in the moment, which is sort of a one-stop shop for planning, also means there's not a lot of transparency. And I'll talk about the concern that some of us had, in particular in relation to bushfire areas, for instance. But I just thought it was worth drawing attention to that piece of paper that he's holding, because I suppose that's his defence, is we're simplifying this. And there is truth, there is definitely a need for some simplification. It's just that I would argue that it's going way too far.
Thanks, Jacqui. And I think it was good to take me back to this one, because I just wanted to recap that the first presentation was about the context of housing supply and planning for that strategically. The second presentation deals with the mechanics of how you approve development. And Jacqui was right to go back to this slide, because it shows, this is really about, and the quote there, it says, "For too long, New South Wales has been hamstrung by a planning system that delays good projects and makes it harder to build the homes our community just desperately needs." So the second tranche to what we're discussing tonight, first being strategic, how you provide housing and what densities. The second tranche that we're talking about is how you make the assessment and approval process more simple and quicker. This is just a slide showing the bill. So Jacqui's mentioned that in her speech at the beginning of the introduction, which is about the bill. It's been tabled in Parliament. It's subject to debate, and I'd say it's fairly imminent, Jacqui.
Yes, I'd say next week.
And Jacqui's touched on this as well, which is about, under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, the first thing you come to is the objectives of that act. What is sought to be achieved? And what's happened under these reforms is they're proposing to expand those objectives. Jacqui's given you much more detail in relation to those changes, but if I could simplify that, what it's seeking to do is take a risk-based approach to planning. It's not elevating the environment over other considerations. It's enabling that assessment to consider all components of development, whether it be housing, the environment, or infrastructure, and take a risk-based approach to determining those applications. It's basically saying the low-risk ones shouldn't hold up the planning system. So it's raising the bar in relation to how it can be assessed. I'm just going to touch on some of the key components of it, and forgive me, I know already that there's some people in the audience who know a significant amount about these reforms, but I'll take you through some of the high-level ones as well. The first one is in relation to the Housing Development Authority, and you've probably seen a bit about this in the press already. This is a new body which has been established to basically say if there's a good idea for housing provision, the state government can indicate its support. Now, the bar there is basically housing developments which are valued at over $60 million. They can make an application to the state government and say, can you call this in to a state significant assessment pathway and rezoning? It's a simplified process which can override council's local planning controls to support higher density development. The one I mentioned earlier about Warringal Mall is an example. So the centre group on behalf of Westfield goes to the state government and says we can deliver 1,500 dwellings towards your target, but it's going to be at a higher density than is permissible under council's local planning controls. The Housing Development Authority then considers if it meets that objective for housing provision and will bring on a certain number of homes in a quicker or a more rapid period. And on that basis, it gets supported. And we're getting a number of these applications. And Jacqui, you're going to ask.
I was just going to say the authority is 3 people, so I have concerns around that. But also that 75% of HDA they're called expressions of interest, EOIs, 75% of them have also been with rezoning with them as well. So that's where I suppose the concern is usually rezoning would go through a council process, and the concern is this is state significant development with 75% of the projects that go to the government, go to this authority for approval to go through to state significant development also include rezoning, which I think from the perspective of all of us means that you don't have a lot of you feel this uncertainty about where you live and what the current zoning is, and we all buy into a place knowing our own zoning and knowing the zoning around us, and it does bring that level of uncertainty as well, I think, when there's a rapid way for rezonings to happen.
Thanks, Jacqui. And that's exactly right. So I mentioned earlier about the work that council's been doing in consultation with the community and state agencies around Frenchs Forest, the hospital precinct. And as part of that process, it was agreement that there needed to be significant investment in infrastructure to support that growth. What we're seeing now in the interim is we're getting applications through the HDA, Housing Development Authority, which is circumnavigating that process and the sound planning work that council done. So the risk is exactly that. We're not seeing the investment, the community consultation that we may otherwise get through that process. The second one is what's called a Development Coordination Authority. So for development applications, a number of development applications at the moment, there may need to be referrals to different state agencies for comment, whether it's bushfire, roads, water, or the environment, or heritage. Those referrals go out to the different agencies, and then they come back to the determining authority to consider all those representations before making a determination. This authority seeks to take all that process out, so instead of going out and asking each of those individual state agencies, one body, which is through the Department of Planning, will be a centralised function providing a coordinated comment in relation to each of those issues back to the determining authority. So it's determined there that it'll speed up the assessment times that councils or the determining authority will get one position in relation to each of those issues.
And then again, this authority is one person. It's the planning secretary. I mean, the planning secretary has delegation abilities, but it is, it's called an authority, it's one person. And I think the concern I have is around the transparency. So as you mentioned, James, you might have an agency with environmental concerns. An example might be you've got to preserve these trees, but then for fire concerns you might say you've got to take those trees down. The final decision that's given, there's not a lot of transparency about how maybe those two conflicting agency advices were reconciled. So I suppose that's the concern that I've had as well.
Yeah, certainly a concern's been raised by some groups about the ability for that one central group or person to consider bushfire impacts if there's for instance, competing interests between bushfire protection and vegetation, or vice versa, who's going to override the specialist advice from one of those groups. The second point is in relation to planning panels. So in the determination of development applications, there's a number of different pathways that can be followed depending on certain criteria. Largely either the nature of development or the cost of works. At the moment we have a tiered system. Some can be assessed by council officers under delegation. Some go to what's called a local planning panel, which comprises representatives from that are selected by the individual local government area. Or you have a regional panel for the larger developments, and that comprises 3 state-appointed members and 2 locally appointed members. The proposal is to collapse that, to do away with the regional planning panels and move those functions back to the local planning panels.
I don't have anything really to say there, except I think councillors, I think this is one of the areas that was broadly supported if we were going to have change. Am I making the right sort of comment here? I think compared to, there was a lot in the Act that I was opposing, but generally maybe simplification of the planning panel was welcomed by some councils, or at least LGA New South Wales.
Yeah. The advice we've given to our elected representatives is that's not necessarily a bad provision for the reasons I've outlined, which is for the local planning panel, council selects all those members, technical and community. The regional planning panel, it's 3 state, which outnumber the 2 nominated by the council. So putting my council hat on, I'm looking at the wrong slide now, but previous slide, I don't think that is a bad initiative for the councils.
And also I was lucky enough not just to consult with council, but we have members in here, I know Frank's here today, who have sat on panels or do sit on panels, so being able to get that feedback and advice from them was very helpful to me. Because as I said, there wasn't a lot of time to consider this complex legislation. It was introduced and rammed through the House very quickly.
Once again, sorry to the people at the back of the room, but now I'm going to take you through the assessment process for development applications, and Jacqui touched on this. There's 3 components: complying development, targeted assessment, and the development application, and I'm going to take you through those each individually. In relation to complying development, if you're not familiar, complying development is routine, identified through a state policy as what's seen as routine development. It can be dwellings, alterations and additions to dwellings, where specific criteria are met. So the state policy says you can do alterations, additions to your house or build a new house subject to these specific criteria: height, setbacks, floor space, car parking, landscaping. And if you can't meet any of those standards, you can't tick the box by a private certifier, you must lodge a development application. There's no grey area, it's either you're in or you're out. What they're proposing under expanding complying development is there will be development that you can vary certain development standards. We don't know what they are, and we don't know the process at this stage for necessarily varying those development standards, other than they're proposed to come to council, and if we don't tick the OK button within 10 days, they'll be deemed to be acceptable and approved. So at the moment it's very black or white. Under what's proposed now is there's going to be certain, I hear the groans, we don't know, and I agree with you, but we don't know the detail, which is we don't know which development standards and we don't know the process, but in concept it's going to add a grey area to what's very much black or white at the moment.
And without that opportunity for community voice, because I know a lot of DAs that come up that have variations from the local planning controls. People have picked up on them and been very vocal, whether that's heights or setbacks. And so with this approach, with existing, which would be usually compliant development, as you said, it usually would not be compliant development if there was any variation. And now minor variations, whatever they are, will be allowed to go through as CDCs.
Yeah, and to be fair, we don't know the detail of that. So, for instance, at the moment, if you need a 900 mil setback, we don't know if it's going to be what sort of variation you may need, or even if it's setback. So,
and it does. I was going to say, it puts a lot of pressure on council, does it not? If you've got this 10 days, if you don't get to it, someone like your workload, if you don't get to that within 10 days, it automatically is approved. Ruth wants to talk about this. We'll
Business
take it on
days.
notice.
No,
Yeah.
I've got
Thanks.
I've got Mel helping me out here, and he assures me it's business day. So, thanks, Mel. Yes, it will, but that's putting my council hat on. I think the residents will be more probably concerned about variations, but it certainly will potentially have resource implications for council. Might also just see that they get a lot really quick refusals because there's no appeal rights against them. The next one is in relation to targeted assessment pathway, and Jacqui mentioned this once again in their opening comments, which is what is proposed there. It's a combination between complying development and a full DA. And what they're saying there is, I mentioned it earlier, if there's strategic work done, in other words, a detailed master plan or what's called the pattern book, which is designed for terraces and townhouses, if you comply with those strategic documents, they're proposing there's a streamlined development assessment process. It will mean that there's no need to undertake environmental assessment, no site suitability, and no public interest test, because it's on the basis that that work has already been done. So what they're saying is if that work has already been done and you've tested those components, so in other words, if you've done a master plan and now someone's coming back and just putting the plan that had been envisaged, you've done the traffic analysis, you've done the urban design analysis, you've done all that work, and someone's now just coming back with the detailed proposal to fit into that plan, this is how we understand it, there'll be a quicker process. It'll be on the basis that that work has already been done. But once again, Jacqui, the devil will be in the detail. Other than the reference to this pattern book, which is the designs for terraces and the townhouse alike, we don't know where else that is going to apply, and we don't know the detail about how that be rolled out.
Yeah, that's right. And there will be more targeted assessment pathways declared, but they won't have the scrutiny of Parliament. So this is one example, but we're actually not sure what other future pathways exist. And this is where the government, we put pressure on the government to move an amendment to say this was related to housing only, because it wasn't clear whether this could be for data centres. And I know Lane Cove Council is dealing, I think, with a data centre application at the moment. Don't quote me on that. But we were just at least trying to make sure this was, because there's so much unknown, limited to housing and not huge developments across New South Wales. But yeah, there is still some uncertainty there.
The next one relates to modifications to development consent. So quite often once a development application's been approved, an applicant may come back and seek modifications to that approval. And there's two types of modifications at the moment. One which has got small or minimal environmental impacts, procedural, and ones which may have greater environmental impacts. And what they're proposing under these reforms is to speed up those minor ones that get caught up in the system, whether it's a modification to conditions or the like. The councils must determine them within 14 days. And once again, if they're not determined by the council within 14 days, they'll be deemed to be approved. I think the biggest issue for council there, once again, will be how we allocate resources to focus on minor applications at the expense of other applications as well. Well, my understanding is it'll be minor, so it will be a case of we assess it or not. We won't be going back to applicants. It'll be determined within that time frame. We won't be having discussions with those time frames. These are only meant to be, as I say, I'm not here to talk to you about the merits of the changes, but these changes are meant, we understand, dealing with procedural minor changes which wouldn't go to the path you're saying, which is we need to go back and seek clarification from an applicant. Minor wording of a condition or something like that. This one probably has potential to have a greater impact for the community, which is, you may be aware that at the moment under legislation, each local government area needs to prepare what's called a community participation plan. And that plan outlines council's commitment to consult with the community on planning matters, planning proposals and development applications. Under these reforms, it is proposed to do away with individual local government area participation plans, and the state government will prepare a model one which will dictate how a local government area consults with its community on planning matters. Appeals and reviews. So some of you may be aware that someone who's dissatisfied with a determination of a development application have a right of appeal. They can appeal to the Land Environment Court for a review of that determination. It takes considerable resources for the council and for an applicant in terms of those appeals. In my view, these are quite positive changes. At the moment, we get a large number of deemed refusals, which means after 40 days, for most development applications, an applicant can say that that application is deemed to have been refused by the council, and they can lodge an appeal within the Land Environment Court. It's after 40 days. So what we're seeing more and more is applicants as basically a backup. They're after 40 days, they're lodging an appeal in the Land Environment Court and having that as assurance that if I don't get the outcome through the normal DA process, I've got an appeal running and I can deal with it through the court. To try and disincentivise that process, so that an applicant can lodge that appeal after 40 days, but they must lodge that appeal within 6 months. So developers are getting on the front foot and going, well, I better not miss out on that 6-month appeal right, so I'll lodge it early. What they're saying under these reforms is saying, we'll do away with that 6 months. You can lodge a deemed refusal at any time up until that application is determined. So hopefully the conversation will be there'll be less incentive for developers to run off and lodge an appeal to preserve their appeal rights as part of the process. The second one is in relation to, rather than going through the court process, someone who is unsatisfied with the determination of their DA, under current legislation, they can ask for a review of that determination by the council. But legislation dictates that that review must be lodged and determined within 6 months. And there's a difficulty with that. If there's a refusal, sometimes it takes an applicant some time to address the grounds for refusal, prepare amended documentation, and then the council, if it has to go back to a planning panel, that is a very tight time frame, that 6 months. So what often they do is they don't ask for a review, they just run straight to court. So it's now being determined that if you ask for a review by the council, you put on pause your appeal rights. Hopefully people will come to council and ask for a review rather than running to court. The other component of it is if you don't want council determining it, you can request that it go to a planning panel for an independent review. So hopefully those two initiatives, in my view, may assist in reducing appeals and could be seen as a positive outcome. Jacqui talked a little bit about changes that have been negotiated through the process. I don't know if you want to speak to this one, Jacqui, but it's a positive.
So the bushfire provisions they are in the Planning Act at the moment, and the government was seeking to take them out of the Act and to have them just within a SEP. There was significant pushback from that, led by Michael Regan, the member for Wakehurst, and I think it's of particular importance to our area because we are a bushfire-prone area, to make sure that there were provisions that remained in the Act. So we did have success for that to be retained in the Act, and as I mentioned as well, there are concerns around that one-stop shop for approvals, because if we do have a situation where the RFS has indicated a development may not be appropriate because of bushfire risk, and that's overridden, there's not a lot of transparency there, but at least the bushfire provisions are retained in the Act, and that was, Michael Regan was very big on pushing that through, which got the support of the government in the end.
Jacqui, I don't know if you wanted to finish the next slide. This is pretty much my last slide, which was just in implementation and the way forward for those reforms.
Yeah, I think the implementation's interesting because the government did expect this to pass last sitting period, and what was interesting, that I think it was filibustered to a certain extent by the Greens and the many amendments that they had. It's now slipped into next week's Parliament. What's been interesting is since then, I think on the presumption that it would pass last Parliament, there have already been discussions around Investment Development Authority as well, a new authority, and while that's not contained in the Act, that was discussed by the Premier, I think last week it was, to the mining industry as well. So I think that was a big red flag to me that this is evolving not just for planning but for developments across the state. In terms of this, how this will be implemented, it is likely to pass next week, or at least this sitting period. And then there is already confusion, I think, around planning panels. So for instance, in Narrabeen, with the state significant development for the Indigo by Moran development, I had heard that there was a discussion around the planning panel not being in existence. However, I thought, my understanding was that would only be when these reforms were passed. So in terms of implementation, I think we're still looking at, it was a question, did you look into that at all, James? That particular question around the panel in the Indigo by Moran that came up in the meeting the other day?
Short answer, yes.
Yeah, and what was the answer?
So I didn't go on to that tonight, but there's another panel, makes it even more confusing, but there's a panel that sits above all of them, which is the Independent Planning Commission, and they deal with state significant development, and we do have one of those applications in at the moment. Legislation went through on the 17th of October,
okay.
Which means that certain applications, including senior housing, no longer needs to be reported up to the IPC. And can be determined by officers and the delegate through that process.
So there's, again, consolidation of power.
Yeah, we're just checking, we've got a little bit more homework to do on that one because this is a new process. We're just checking to confirm the involvement of residents in that decision-making process. Okay,
so that shows already implementation is starting to happen and we're just getting a bit of clarity on it. The community consultation that was spoken about, we're now going to have a consistent state community consultation plan. Now, for some councils, that may be great because it might be lifting the standard, but given the rhetoric of the government and the intention of the government, my concern, it will be the lowest common denominator community consultation plan, and it will be less than what we've got now through the current council and the current council's plan. Having said that, there will be consultation on what that will look like, and that's going to happen in that next 3 to 6 month period. And then within 6 to 9 months, this whole reform will be fully operational with targeted assessment pathways. There will be new pathways announced, they will be exhibited, and there will be some consultation when those happen, and that's very similar to what happened with the low to mid-rise reforms. I think the thing I would urge everyone to do is I will be updating through newsletters and on local forums, but when these consultations come out, that's when we've got to have our voice heard, and that's when I really encourage people to make submissions. I look back on that 2023 post I did about low to mid-rise when I was encouraging submissions. I think I had 2 thumbs up. Like, no comments, 2 thumbs up, no one saying, yes, I'm going to write a submission, and it's just human nature that until these changes start happening, that we understand them and that we're feeling them, that we want to have our voice heard. And unfortunately, the way that the policy develops in this area, that often is too late. So in case there are, and I don't know whether there'll be ones relating to Mona Vale or our area, but my ask is, I suppose, if they are announced and there are consultation periods, including for this community consultation plan that will be implemented across the state, spend an hour, spend 2 hours just writing a submission and putting your voice into a submission, because that's the most effective way that we can mould some of these reforms, if at all, and council will be consulted on some of these as well. Yeah. Okay, great. I'll just... We'll open up to the floor in a second. I just wanted to say as well, I know some of you are feeling the impacts of this already, and I know how distressing that can be. I mean, there will be other people in the room that will have, the flip side is they'll have opportunities to sell or to be in a zone where their property prices increased, but you also equally could be in an area where your property price decreased, or that you're facing a development next door where you're going to have impacts to your amenity. I understand that is very, very distressing, and my office has been incredibly, I just want to acknowledge Rebecca's here and other people who work for me as well, who have just really tried to hear your concerns and give guidance. We are not experts on writing submissions, although, we can give you the knowledge that we've got, and obviously council's been great as well. I think if there is an opportunity to write submissions to some of these developments, recruit and mobilise others and write those submissions, and don't use emotive language. By all means explain how your amenity will be impacted, but be very factual as you can, and respond to those things. Look up the planning scheme, look up the SEP. So I know we're talking to people from Indigo by Moran as well. Look up what the controls are and be very factual in your responses, but do encourage others to respond. Petitions don't work. Individual submissions are where you need to encourage people to put the time in to do. So a petition in some circumstances is great, but in regards to development applications or state significant developments, it's very important you do your own individual submission and to make that different. So don't do the copy and paste from a neighbour. So put your own flavour on it and really describe particularly how the impacts will impact you, either as a direct neighbour or as someone in the neighbourhood who's concerned. I know also people are concerned, sorry Dick, I'll get you in 1 second. I know also people concerned if you live in an apartment block and this 75% threshold as well, where other members of your apartment block do want to sell and you don't, and there's that 75% threshold. I know that's concerning as well, and I'm talking to people about that, and it's important that I hear what is happening in this electorate. I want to acknowledge Phil Walker, who sat outside here for, weeks on a Saturday, listening to people from the community, and did feed a lot of those stories back to me, and those stories I can then put into context, understand what I need to advocate for, and also paint the picture for what's happening on the ground as a result of these reforms. So I encourage you to communicate with my office. We can't help everyone with every submission. One of the things I'm struggling with at the moment is how I make submissions and with the workload that is required, and it won't be feasible for me to make a submission to every development. So I just want to make that clear because, as you know, we've got issues at the hospital. There's actually a doctor's meeting at the hospital tonight that I'm trying to be involved in as well. So there's a lot going on. My office will be supportive, but get involved and write your own submissions as well, and let me know how these things are impacting you, because even if I can't solve the problem, I can continue to advocate for you and put your story on the record and put, give the human impact of what these reforms do. The 75% threshold I mentioned as well does need to go to the Land and Environment Court for approval. So I just wanted to mention that if anyone in the room was concerned about that. I will also just mention that Phil had a photo of me saying Jacqui sells out Monavale, which I completely reject, but I've spoken to Phil about that and he's entitled to do what he wants, but I haven't sold out Monavale at all. In fact, I'm pretty much one of the only people in Parliament calling out these reforms and really campaigning for community-led planning, and I will not stop because I do believe in our planning system being how it has been. I understand it had inefficiencies, but I believe in community controls, the local environment plan and council-led planning. So I'm in opposition to all of this, let it be very clear. I also know that James put up some figures around, particularly with low to mid-rise, what the requirements are for parking, and some of those figures are a bit shocking. So, half a parking space required for a dwelling. We are going to have then stress on our infrastructure, so something that I will be pushing for is support for infrastructure, and I know that, is also a council issue as well, thinking about how the town centre flows, thinking about parking stations, but rest assured that, I'll be working with council and advocating for some of those infrastructure things as well. I want to hear the real world impacts. I can't say this is all going to go through next week, but I suppose I just do want to end on, before we go to questions, that Part 3A, some of you may remember, which were reforms very similar to these ones, and through community voice and community opposition over time did get reversed. So I think in politics things go very, very slowly until they go very, very fast. Who knows what the future holds? This is the current state of play now, and I'm sorry that I come to you bringing the bad news, but I also wanted to explain to you what the changes are, because if you're informed, you can obviously be as involved as possible and, tell me your stories and hold me to account as well. Dick's very keen to ask a question. He has had his hand up for a long time, so we'll get a microphone to you. Is Rebecca here? Do you want to take? James, you and I can share one. Dick, do you want to come up? And we ask just everyone keep questions short. So James is such an amazing, I don't want to call you a resource, but you are a resource to have here, to give him time to answer them. Yeah. So Rebecca doesn't get too many steps in today. She's asked that I'm not zigzagging around, so I'll kind of move around the room in an orderly fashion. But Dick, go for it.
Thank you very much, and thank you, James. It is a question for James. If he could explain the process with regard to state significant developments where a planning proposal falls out of or outside of those areas that would conform to the typical transport-oriented development centres that have been identified. And I'm thinking the Trojan horse here is Ingleside, the Wilga-Wilson proposal currently before council. There may well be others in future. What opportunity is there for state significant development to kind of get outside around council?
It's an excellent question. And I wish I had a precise answer for you because it's not clear to us. We had a discussion with a proponent today exactly on that issue. So I mentioned to you before that a proponent who has a site which can provide housing and it's valued over 60 mil can go to the Housing Development Authority to put forward that proposal. If it's not permitted currently under our planning controls, they can ask for a concurrent rezoning and development application. So our understanding, Jacqui, is that a proponent will prepare a documentation for a DA and they will include the rezoning package as part of that application, which will then be submitted, and our understanding is that they will be processed concurrently.
So in answer to your question, Dick, we don't know, but I think there is that opportunity for a developer.
I've just been listening and wondering when or if social housing will be considered at all. Is it considered by the government? Or will it be considered by the council?
I'm actually not. I can talk to affordable housing, but in terms of social housing, I haven't heard anything for this area. But James might want to comment. No. Yeah, so in terms of social housing and investment from the government in this area, nothing that I've heard of yet. That's not to say it might not be coming. In terms of affordable housing, as James mentioned, what a developer can do, particularly under low to mid-rise, is provide affordable housing and then get a certain height exception. We have passed legislation in the Parliament recently that there will be an affordable housing register, and that's so developers can't game the system. Something that Michael Regan in particular and Alex Greenwich, they had an inquiry on essential worker housing, and essential worker housing is not defined under the Act, but that's a very interesting debate that we're having at the moment is, how do we define or require essential worker housing as well to make sure bus drivers, not so much doctors, but nurses, bus drivers, cleaners and people who we rely on to provide our services are included in that affordable housing. The other issue as well is affordable housing under the current definition isn't so affordable in demographics and areas like ours. So the definition it's not working. So that's another area that needs to be resolved.
So Jacqui mentioned what the state government's doing, so you can get a bonus where you provide affordable housing as part of development. But council's also conscious of this issue, and council has its own affordable housing strategy. I mentioned in my opening that we've got a report going up to the council meeting this month, and that is looking at setting an affordable housing contribution rate to be levied to these 9 centres, as well as other development, so that the developer has to pay council a contribution towards the provision of affordable housing within our local government area. Alternatively, they provide it as part of their development.
I'm just curious as to what provisions are in the Act that will stop people buying places and turning them into Airbnbs, particularly around this area, which is a very popular area for people to have holidays. Because if they build a 7-storey building and most of it's Airbnb, we have not improved the housing for anybody.
And there's no provision at the moment, although I did just the council recently, I think on the 16th of September, I think it was, moved a motion calling on the government and calling on me to make representations to the government around work they have been doing on the short-term rental accommodation. So there has work that's been done, there has been a whole research piece into it, and the government hasn't disclosed the findings of that. So there's more work to be done there, and it's funny that council moved that motion just recently. Does one of the councillors want to just talk to the context of how that's impacting the beaches and what you're looking for?
So the resolution passed was to acknowledge the concerns that you just made, but also going back to affordable housing, we're finding that developers are not actually, what would you say, igniting their development consents, particularly in the Frenchs Forest precinct, because they say it's too expensive. So that then defeats the purpose. But coming specifically back to you, it's calling for better regulation. There's a huge issue at the moment, as Ruth and I are confronting, in Collaroy and Collaroy Plateau, where practically every day they're confronted with one house being an Airbnb, and yet it's more or less become a party zone. So it is a concern. I'm sure Jacqui and other state legislators will take that up.
Borrow this one. I'm not sure if it's you or James, but there was mention of the 5,900 homes. If, for example, that was entirely met by Frenchs Forest and Brookvale, how disconnected is that target from what would then occur with Mona Vale under this plan, the low and mid-rise plan? Would that mean no low and mid-rise homes would be permitted, or
I
would it
brought
mean
that up. So going back to that first meeting I had with Scully when I was fighting the declaration of 5 areas in Pittwater being declared low to mid-rise, we got 1. I was trying to get the whole area exempted, and I said, I brought up the local housing strategy, and I said, look, this is how, I think it's a couple of hundreds short, the local housing strategy, but I said, look, our council's done all the work, this is totally achievable, you know, we can get to the 5,900, and he just said, it doesn't stop there, yeah, that's the target, but it ain't stopping there. So he looked at me like I was an idiot for even suggesting, you know, we can get to there, we can get to this target. He was like, well, that's a target, but we're not stopping there. So that, I mean, in one way, that's been one of the concerns I've had. I know, I don't want to go into detail a lot about it's not the appropriate forum to be talking about de-amalgamation or amalgamation, but one of the concerns I have as well is these local government areas are given housing targets. And at the moment, under the current local housing strategy, we do have densification flagged for Frenchs Forest area, Brookvale that's been mentioned, and south of the Northern Beaches LGA, and I think, you know, every LGA has targets, put it that way. We have done some heavy lifting in Warriewood already, but in answer to your question, Dale, there would never be a basis for an argument to say, well, we can meet them down south so we can get rid of this low to mid-rise, because I've tried that, hasn't worked to date. And in terms of meeting that target, that the state government wants those targets exceeded in the long term, so yeah. But it's a long time away, and probably, you know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm here for it. I'll be fighting for the long time, so we've just got to get the major parties to agree. So start with the opposition.
Thank you. James and Jacqui, thank you very much. Great having this type of communication. I think we've been left in the dark for too long. It's great to get this openness. Thank you. I've got one question, 2 parts, I suppose, best way to describe it. One of the concerns I've got is with this HTA process and whatever else, the greatest knowledge of local development is held by council. When the HTA or one of these other things make those decisions, or even the complying developments make those decisions, there's very little referral back to the knowledge base in council. What opportunity does the council community have to query, refer, complain about a decision made by this HTA? And secondly is, the second part that we've got around here is, the number of people don't believe that the current legislation or regulation, LTPs, DCPs, etc., are being enforced. So if there's a decision made by the HTA or another body, is it the council's responsibility to enforce what is approved in the regulations, and will the council complete with those enforcement? Thank you.
Thank you. In relation to your first question, Council's involvement in the HDA process, there is no formal referral to Council as part of that process, so we don't have an opportunity to consult with our elected representatives before that decision is made. In relation to state significant development, the department does have a enforcement arm that deals with state significant development consents. However, from my experience, the first port of call is Council.
Thanks. Look, I just wanted to say, I had a motion up at the last council meeting to basically write to the state government on behalf of council to oppose this new bill. It'll be coming up at the next council. I'm hoping that the councillors will support it. But I'd also just say, James is effectively a public servant, so he can't criticise the government. But I'm going to criticise the government. We have 1 million empty houses around Australia. And if those houses, a lot of them are Airbnb, and if we had government policies that actually basically supported filling those houses and houses not being used as purely as investments, then we wouldn't be looking at this level of development. So I would also say, I mean, Jacqui is our local MP. I think there's definitely a move away from the two big parties who have supported the bill in the lower house, and the bill is likely to get through next week. But as Jacqui said, back in 2011, the government changed, and one of the reasons was Labor's planning proposals at that time. So even if this gets through, I think I would encourage everybody to basically keep up the fight. And I know we're all sick of writing submissions, but this is one that is really worth fighting for, because it's going to change the whole, within 20 years, the whole appearance and nature of our area will change with this bill.
And I think, and on that as well, I did have a petition for low to mid-rise. I've changed it. If it's either online or tomorrow, I'll send a note out to anyone who registered for the event. But that there will be a petition to as Miranda said, to try and garner opposition. I'm not suggesting that petition will work next week or the week after, but if you do put your name on that, it is a way I'll keep you updated. And I know there are lots of pockets of groups who are forming around particular developments, but I think we're stronger together and over time to mobilise. So that's a way that I can keep you updated of when I speak about it in Parliament, or when I speak about your stories in Parliament, what the plans are, forums like this. So I invite you all to register your details there as well. Now, we had one here, and then I'll go up to you.
Thank you, Jacqui. Just another question regarding the Housing Delivery Authority. Will the Housing Delivery Authority have the power to initiate rezoning of community-owned land in a council area?
No. James is saying no. No. Not yet, so it'll be, that's a no. Not yeah, or not yet. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Hi, Jacqui. How do you think the government's mass immigration policy has affected our need for increasing our housing? Because it was to the tune of over 1 million people last year. I was told by a Labor candidate that they were playing catch-up over the last few years because of COVID and we didn't bring immigrants in. But in my view, empty houses is an important thing to look at.
Yep.
I own an Airbnb, I understand that, but that's only a very small portion. I really think the mass immigration policy, which can be viewed at, buying Labor votes, has got an impact on our housing crisis. How do you feel about that?
Well, firstly, I'll say it's a federal issue, and to be quite frank, I've been so embedded in state issues, I haven't even looked at the recent immigration data. I know there is a good breakdown on Allegra Spender's Instagram account where there's a breakdown of what type of immigration is skilled, what isn't. There was comments that post-COVID there was a peak, and now it's getting back down to pre-COVID levels. I wouldn't be able to, I'd have to take it on notice to give you an informed position on that. What I will say though is that there is some sort of irony between building all these houses and, as James mentioned as well, some of the other limiting factors on housing, which includes the cost of construction and also people able to, having the capacity to, in the construction industry to build. I know that particularly even for bus drivers, there's a call for bus drivers to be on the skilled migration list. So I don't have an informed answer about the overall numbers, but I know it is a complex issue. And how it relates to state planning, it is a federal issue, so I haven't turned my mind to it. And same as the other federal issues that are worthy of discussion in this are around, negative gearing, how we, and state issues, stamp duty should, possibly be exempt for people who are downsizing. Also, maybe if you have people in your house or you rent a house out, then that shouldn't impact your capital gains tax requirements, or you shouldn't have income tax if you're allowing people to stay in your home, because we know back in the day people with big homes used to have boarders come and stay as well. So I think there are federal considerations when it comes to different taxation and immigration that impact on state, but I'd have to take those on notice because I've been really embedded in getting across this legislation in the last couple of weeks, which has been huge, and so I haven't really thought about those external factors, same as the Airbnb short-term rentals, and these are issues that I'm keen to take up, but I don't have an opinion right now on that one. Did we have another?
I've got the microphone. Yeah,
that's easy.
First a song. No, I'm kidding. I'm from Darley Street West. You'll be aware that there's a development going on, which is now state significant in our street. Darley Street West is a little cul-de-sac. My question's around infrastructure. But we are a real-life example of what's going on. So the developer has included affordable housing in the development, and the development is greater than 60 million in cost. So it immediately avails them of the opportunity to go higher. My question is around infrastructure. There are just two roads to get you in and out of Mona Vale. It's Mona Vale Road and it's Pittwater Road. With the improved or the increased development, and my question is probably for James, I'm imagining the council is grappling with the kinds of solutions to infrastructure, and I'd like to, if he can, to have him expand on how they will deal with that. We won't get any new highways, we won't get a train, we won't get any new ferries. There is a critical mass to the amount of people you can get in and out of our little community and have the village still function.
Yeah.
So, are there any plans at this stage around the improvements that might be done to infrastructure?
Well, the short answer to that is no, and that's why I asked for Pittwater to be excluded from...
I thought that would be your answer.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not my position, but I'm saying, you asked, is the government being infrastructure first towards planning? They're not. They say, we're not infrastructure first, we're housing infrastructure second. So that's one of the things I've disagreed with and spoken about in Parliament, is that I think we should plan infrastructure, and that's the problem with the blanket planning laws. It's also why I fought for Pittwater to be completely excluded for the geographical reasons, one road in, one road out, if you're talking about the peninsula. Failed infrastructure on every single one of our roads out of here, so obviously Mona Vale Road is not finished. I think in 1967 or 76, Premier Askin said it was going to be 4 lanes. We're still waiting for that. Wakehurst Parkway still floods. Even with the improvements, that flood rate is going to decrease, but it's not going to be, for huge inundations. It is still likely to flood once or twice a year, even with all the upgrades. And we've got the A8 corridor across, along the coast, which is on the Australian infrastructure priority list because of congestion. It leads to the Spit Bridge, which obviously is still archaic, lifting up. And I just might note as well that on the New South Wales Disaster Mitigation Strategy of 2023, when you look at the impacts of extreme weather and weather, I think it's climate change. I know there are some people in the room that don't. Whatever you think it is, we've got more extreme weather, and then we just had some thunder then. But the fact is, when you look at how that's going to impact our electorate by 2060, we are the number one LGA in New South Wales that is going to have the greatest annual losses as a result of extreme weather. When you look at whether that's split between bushfire or coastal or flooding, it's mainly coastal. When I bring that up with the planning minister, he said, oh, well, you're only ranked number one because you've got the most expensive houses, which is true, which factors into the loss, but at the same time we are highly, highly exposed electorate and highly exposed LGA, both bushfire, flooding. A few years ago we've had, we were effectively an island because Roseville Bridge flooded, Wakehurst flooded and Narrabeen. So in answer to your question, we have big infrastructure issues. That is exactly where I'll be advocating for investment, and I've been like a dog with a bone about a number of investments, and we will have to improve the bus corridor, but you're right, this is going to be strain on infrastructure, and we need to get it approved and get it done. But government has been very much, we're build, get government out of the way, we're building, and infrastructure second. Do you want
just to follow up on that. I know that James said that council was grappling with possible solutions. Are there any? Have you found any that might be useful? Again, like I say, that they can't do much with Pittwater Road, and they certainly can't do much more with Monaville Road once it's finished. What other solutions around infrastructure are being thrown around is my question.
No, I'm just going to say you're spot on. And this is a problem with the process we've got, which is it's ad hoc planning. It's not a strategic approach to planning. The way local government normally works, as I said before, is we look at a precinct. The hospital precinct is a prime example. Identify locations, identify the road improvements, and get agreement that development will follow the infrastructure provided. That's planning 101. This is opposite to that, which is we'll get the planning, we'll get the housing, and then you try and retrofit, which is always difficult because of exactly the reasons you say. You're trying to put in increased density into an old infrastructure network, whether that be the pipes, the pits, the roads, the footpaths. So you're spot on. This is why it's not great planning. In relation to your question though, that doesn't help you because the DA's in. My advice to you is I met a group from down who are dealing with the Ocean Street development. You just, as Jacqui said, you just need to put those concerns in writing to the state government. My advice would be write to the state government, write to the planning minister, write to the premier, write to all groups, let them know the concerns. The consent authority still needs to consider the same issues. They've got to consider whether or not that site is suitable for development. They still need to make that assessment and they need to be satisfied. So your role now is the same as council. We'll review it, but it is in the context, as Jacqui and we said at the beginning, about the need for housing provision. Unfortunately, that's all I can offer you. In relation to what council's doing, we are doing some modelling about how much housing will be provided to inform what we can do for infrastructure. But it is problematic if you're looking at how you can widen a road with acquisitions. It's beyond the purse of local government to start acquiring properties for a single development. So it's particularly challenging in the framework we're working with.
I know Miranda spoke, I'll get your question next. I know Miranda spoke about thinking, differently, like the existing vacant tenancies we've got and opening those up, but also I've spoken with her and others before as well is about, we have had the federal government look into the high-speed train to Newcastle. Where are we looking at having different regional plans and continuing that discussion, which is silent in New South Wales Parliament at the moment. With these reforms as well, which I forgot to mention, is a lot of the metropolitan strategic planning for Sydney is gone. So all the work that was done for strategic planning has been wiped out of the Act, and that was done in a previous piece of legislation as well. So much to what James said, this concept of ground-up strategic planning or even strategic planning for our cities is kind of out the window now. That's not to say we can't get that back, but to the point that I made before, this is why I would encourage you, even if you are engaged in a development at the moment, and that will be in the scheme of things, maybe, short, sharp, horrendous, please stay engaged post that, and please stay engaged post the interest that brought you here tonight, because it is going to be a sustained discussion and engagement of how we move through the future with planning. Sorry, I just kept talking when it was
Yes, we've just been...
Push that one up.
Very recently. Yeah. So, if we're going to lodge a submission, which we are there any studies that have been done by the government or by council that we could rely upon to make our arguments more effective in our submission?
Which day are you talking about, or submission are you talking about?
Well, our problem is 67 Ellamata Road and 19A Rowan Street. We only just became aware of that 4 weeks ago because a neighbour told us about it.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a DA, so that would be just looking, are you aware of that one? Yeah. And look, I do have to respect as well, James can't give advice on anything, all and every DAs, because we'd be here all night, but which one was that again?
67 Ellamata Road and 19A Rowan Street.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering, is there any studies, like population studies, traffic studies?
It would be, if you went onto the council website, so ones that are really good to reference is you can look up the local environment planning, like local controls, through New South Wales Planning Portal, and you can go onto the map there and use the address and find out what the planning controls are, and then see what the planning controls are. And then otherwise on the council website, things like the local housing strategy has a lot of work done. Or that in particular areas, you've got reports on certain things that gives certain strength to it. But a lot of the time it will be reviewing the proponent's own materials, and that will get you a lot of information around, geotechnical risks and things like that. But it is, do you have anything to add to that in terms of enhancing someone's submission with work council's already done?
Just in relation to submissions, I understand that when a DA gets lobbed in next to you, it's quite distressing. I understand that there's this idea that you've got to become an instant town planner or a lawyer overnight. And you can if you want. I guess my experience with planning panels is they want to hear, in your own words, without the colourful language, how that development is going to impact on you. There are town planners within council, there's town planners within the state government, there's town planners on the planning panels, which are going to have to go through and make sure that it ticks off all those legislative boxes. But the planning panel will want to know, as a neighbouring resident, how that development affects you. So my advice to you is, by all means, you can spend as much time as you like, and I'm not going to say don't read the technical reports if you want to, because it's certainly out there for you to provide feedback. But I'm just saying, if you're not comfortable doing that, it shouldn't mean that you don't put a submission in. You should write down and sit down and go, well, I don't like this development. Why don't I like it? And it could be because it's a metre off the boundary and I'm going to get overshadowing all day. It could be because there's a balcony and it's going to look straight into my living area. So my advice to you is spend as much time as you want, but make sure that it represents how this development is going to impact on you as a resident. And if it means you want to go and get a technical expert to assist you, by all means, but you don't have to. You just need to put the submission in from your perspective.
2 more questions. Oh, there's one here.
Yeah, look, for the younger generation, I'm looking around and say ageing population in Northern Beaches. Mine's more around infrastructure. Let's park the roads. It's more around schools, sports grounds. We're going to add 6,000 people to our area. What schools are we adding?
Yeah, and this.
What parks are we adding? I think the New South Wales Planning did put forward a full proposal for Ingleside a number of years ago, which did put forward new sports grounds, shopping centres, schools, which was pushed back by the local government at the time. Are we going to reopen that portion and say maybe we do need to look at rezoning parts of Ingleside for sports grounds, for actual infrastructure, which will help the wider local government instead of putting housing there.
Yeah, and I think that's the irony with what we're facing up at Ingleside at the moment. So if we put aside the bushfire risks and assume they weren't there for a second, the irony is that there was an incredible amount of work done under 2 Ingleside Place plans, and as you said, it included sports fields, and now we have a Wilga-Wilson proposal, which is not state significant, although you can never rule that out, but is planning a huge amount of development without that infrastructure. In answer to your question, where is it? Well, it will fall to council and me as a state rep asking the state government for money and advocating for money, but the strategy will need to fall at the moment on local council because some of those broader strategies and place strategies haven't occurred, and this is exactly the risk that we're facing. I suppose to talk specifically here about Pittwater, our schools aren't at capacity at the moment. In fact, we have dwindling numbers in our public schools, both in the primary schools and also the high schools. So we don't have an infrastructure issue in terms of the capacity. We do have an infrastructure issue in that our high schools could do with some investment. They've been neglected for a very long time. So Narrabeen Sports High, I mean, they're fantastic schools, don't get me wrong, and there has been investment bits here and there, but that is something that as a state MP I've got to continue to advocate for. Narrabeen Sports High is getting a huge new performance centre, which they're so excited about. So that's one example. So in terms of that infrastructure, we don't need schools as much, we just need to invest in the schools we've got. In terms of sports fields, we need a huge uplift. I actually can't believe that these amenity blocks and a lot of the sports fields haven't been updated in years. Council has constraints, council has money constraints. I'll have to, as a state MP, advocate. There are grant programs, but these things will be long-term advocacy, and I look forward to, council will be doing some amazing planning, and probably they can talk to what's being done now. But yeah, over time, it'll be a joint effort between council and myself or whoever the representatives of the time, asking for more strategic planning and the money to then be able to invest in that strategic planning. Because I think Ingleside is a good example of the irony there, that it did have a place strategy. It's been knocked back because of bushfire, which was a very legitimate reason, but now we're facing a development that doesn't have the need to provide a sports field, for instance. Did you want to add to that, James?
Thanks, Jacqui. Just in relation to the comment that council rejected having sports fields, that's incorrect. Council has constantly sought to promote more sports fields. I think one of the issues recently has been 6 years ago the state government actually proposed having a sports field rectification off Forest Way, and only last month council received advice that the state government did not include that in the budget, and that was $6 million. So that is a significant loss. There was also the old Tipside. Pardon? What was it? 2019, Ruth thinks. So it's only recently that they've told us that they're withdrawing that funding. So that's a concern. And then there's also been past promises, such as at the old tip at Belrose, to have further, it was going to be a netball facility and other facilities, and that was withdrawn. So it's not as if council isn't trying on sports fields, but unfortunately we lack the money for it. Yep, a precinct. Yep. Mm. Mm. So in relation to the Frenchs Forest precinct as an example, no, I'm just giving you an example. Yeah, so I'll go for Frenchs Forest because that's something that is, yet again, an example of the horse before the cart, in that for stages 2 and 3 to progress, the government said you needed to have the tunnel as well as the East-West Rapid transport line. Now, there's no money to provide that. So how then can we effectively plan when that happens. And yes, I acknowledge your concerns that the current Ingleside proposal does not have the community centre that was previously provided for, nor the sports fields. And that's another reason why it should be rejected.
I noticed there are a lot of different groups in this area all representing their own little concerns. We need an active local residents association. See Kelvin Auld afterwards. Tell him you want to join the Munavale Residents Association, because God, I've been trying to get it going for 5 years and I'm sick and tired of waiting for it to happen. We need an active group in the community. The Munavale Place Plan, we've been waiting for 5 years to come through. It's still not coming through council, but you'll be surprised what they're going to throw at you very soon, so be ready. And the other thing is, I want to thank Jacqui tonight, because this was an excellent presentation. And James.
But I would echo that as well. As an MP, we have 27 residents groups in Pittwater. There are none in Wakehurst, but they're incredibly knowledgeable and useful for me as a state MP to be talking to the community via those groups. And also, if I need comment, I can go to Kelvin or others who represent these groups and get comment from their groups. So it's a very good model. So I do encourage and echo what Mark said, is to join the Mona Vale Residents Group. Or I know Dick's here with the Eleanora Heights Residents Group as well. So join your local residents groups is, the big takeaway.
Thanks, Jacqui. I just want to really understand how we can get the developers in their applications to have to do some community benefit, because they are making many millions of dollars out of the applications that they're putting in, but they're not really coming up with any community benefits. So their applications are very just isolated to the actual development that they're putting in, but there's no benefit to anyone else except for them. So just wondering thoughts on that.
That goes to the previous question, and also the questions around developer contributions. So technically developer contributions should be contributing to give money to council to be able to implement strategic plans, but even under some of these reforms, the development contributions are on a net basis are decreasing. Is that correct? Yeah. Net basis decreasing, which is again my cynicism around the reforms and them being developer-led, because there's definitely a lot of lobbying that is paid off in droves. But those sorts of things, that's why it's important for me to keep advocating for that and working with council to support developer contributions, because usually that's the way it works, is that they will provide money that then council implements. Is that right? Why are you laughing? Have I missed something? No. Okay, good. All right, did you have any comment on that? No, but I think the net contributions are going down under this strategy, which is appalling. We had one more here, sorry.
Hi, yep. Oh, okay. I'm a long-time resident of Sea Beach Avenue behind the Sea Beach Gardens retirement village. We're in a flood zone there, and we've got 23 units, of which only occupied tenants, and 3 Airbnbs, which are quite often vacant. Being in a flood zone, I'm just interested as to how high they can go, and also if the retirement village can up their levels as well too, which will cause shadowing, no doubt.
Do you have any comment on that, James? Yeah, no. And well, look, the answer is, there was a national cabinet meeting a number of years ago where federal government, state government got together and say no one will ever build again in a flood zone because it's costing us, in our insurances, up by 33% in the last 2 years, because we're paying for impacts to people's homes in flood zones, in bushfire areas. However, the current reforms still are allowing building, and what's interesting is even in areas which we know are flooded, they're not looking into the future to look at the future impacts as well, which one of the issues I have. In those zones that have been declared as growth zones, that those flooding concerns are being ignored on the surface of it, as in these areas have been declared. But when it comes to the development application or the state significant application, that's where the proponent will have to put forward all the expert reports from geologists, from from the environmental assessments, and they need to be considered. But I agree, it's a concern I have that we shouldn't be building in vulnerable areas.
Yeah, I'd just make another point. A lot of these units are studios, and being, I'm an owner, but if we sell out, we've got a developer sniffing around already, and if we sell out now, how are we going to be able to afford something else after that? Because you can't go smaller than a bedsit apart from a caravan or a tent.
And that's where, in that sort of development, the net benefit would be less houses than more houses, which is a perverse outcome. Yeah,
absolutely, and being forced out.
And that's where that's something I'm interested in, trying to put in a provision around essential worker housing, but also around that there needs to be a net benefit to housing, so we can't have bed sits knocked down for a couple of penthouses. Yeah. I think we'll call it there. I mean, I'll hang around a bit if anyone wants to ask me a question. I just want to thank James so much, because he's new. He's not new in terms of planning. He's very, very knowledgeable, but he's new to Northern Beaches Council. He said yes to be gracious probably, and didn't realise what work I was going to lump on him. But I obviously know the legislation, although the legislation's only a couple of weeks old. But to be able to understand how it's going to impact council, all the real life impacts, to the extent that I could in such a short time, Northern Beaches Council has been amazing and continues to be amazing in keeping the community informed and keeping me informed about what we're doing and the implications of these changes. And for him to present them so succinctly when it's such complex legislation, I think it really brought, everyone could understand, or hopefully that's the case. So thank you to James, and thank you to Mal for coming from council.